And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How are you?
I'm very well, Brian. Hey, I just want to let everybody know we're having a little construction happening at the house today. I don't think you're going to hear it, but if there's some bangs and bumps, that's where it's coming from. Just to let you know. Otherwise, I'm great. Spring has sprung. The grass is riz. Flowers are everywhere. Just an absolutely beautiful day here in California.
Awesome. Awesome. We also have some housekeeping sort of thing. For those of you watching on YouTube, you're going to notice that we are stacked a little bit differently now in order to make us more social media present. And so we fit on Instagram and all of these sort of things. We're changing the way we are appearing on our YouTube channel. Please do us a favor. Let us know what you think. I'm really curious about this because some people may love it. Some people may hate it. I'm just curious. So if you would leave a comment there or email us at movingcombos@gmail.com, we would highly appreciate it. And as always, hit that like and subscribe button. We really appreciate it. Comment when you can. The comments do help. Our numbers keep rising every week. And as Nora and I have both found out, I just got back from very, very sunny and, oh my gosh, very hot Arizona. It was triple digits. I did not expect that, but it was triple digits already. At the Firm Body Pilates, I was teaching a post-rehab summit. It was fantastic. Wonderful, wonderful students. I wanted to thank both Jody and Tara for inviting me. We had a wonderful time doing post-rehabilitation stuff. So thank you guys very much. But yes, I was expecting spring, not summer.
It's Phoenix, baby.
Degrees. Oh my gosh.
Not usually that bad in April.
That's
we've been there a lot in April for Pilates
exactly.
on tour and things, and it's usually been moderate.
80s?
I mean, it's been hot, but it's not been 105. That's
no,
I
expected 80s or something like that, and even told my kids because I brought them to visit grandma. I said, "Oh, it's going to be great. You know, it'll be 80 degrees. It'll be." And I looked and I saw 103 when we arrived, 105 the next day. I said, "Oh, it's going to be a little warm, guys. Just a little bit. It's going to be a little warm."
So with that in mind, we also want to let you know that we are planning a similar kind of post-rehab summit with Brian and I together in Southern California. We're going to be at Blue Moon Pilates, and this is in September, so it's a good bit of time from now. And we'll let you know when registration opens, but we just want to give you a little preview that will be happening. If you want to come down to Mission Viejo in the middle of September, we would love to see you there.
Should be beautiful. I can't wait. And if you'd like us to schedule a time to come into your studio, we'd be more than happy to talk with you. You can always email us, movingcombos@gmail.com. We aim to please, and we're getting out there and teaching a lot more. So this is good. We're having a lot of fun doing this.
Absolutely.
Taking it on the road.
Taking it on the road. So today we're kind of going back. We're going into a lot of really interesting topics, women's health and some osteoporosis. And we've talked a lot about the foot. So a lot of different things we're working on. We kind of wanted to back us up into a little bit of basics. So today's going to be a bone basics, as it were, talking about joints, talking about bones, just a little bit of kind of an anatomy primer for those of you who are, either need a refresher or just want to know a little more. So we'll start with the bones.
I think you and I have both talked in the past that we should, in high school, have an anatomy course. You learn such bare basics, about the anatomy. And I think it would be so important. This is the vehicle that we drive around in all day, right here.
Exactly.
We should know more about what we're walking around with. We should know how to build muscle. We should know what bone health is. We should just know what bones are made of and understand. And that's really not covered nearly enough, I find. And
at all.
My kids are in high school and they know more from me talking to them just off the cuff than they ever have in biology or any of the other classes. So I think that this is important for anybody who listens to this to have a little bit of a refresher, to understand what the bones are, what they do, and especially bouncing off of the last 2 weeks of talking about osteoporosis, which is so in the news. And you and I constantly get people asking us questions about it that I think, and that's why I said, let's go backwards a little bit and talk about the bones and make May sort of our bone month and discuss, what exactly they are, what they're made of, what builds them, what doesn't, and just go from there.
One other little piece to that is you build your bones before you're 30.
Yeah.
Right. So again, a lot of our bone mass is built when we're younger and really way before 30 in your teens and in your early 20s. And I think to even have that information, I don't know, you never know what information is going to mean anything when you're 18 years old and you think you're immortal, but it might help, right? Giving people that idea that this is the time to build your strength, to build your bones, to build your balance, to build a lot of the skills that are then going to really last you for the rest of your life or not, if you don't build them then.
And I think it just in general, training when you're young for not only bone
Yeah,
health, but
for
muscle, everything
everything.
else. I mean, people, take a look at someone who has been training for many, many years when they are in their 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You can see they have muscle maturity. They stand with better posture. They just look in better shape than the person who did nothing their entire life, sat at a computer or sat at an office job and
Yep.
never played sports, never trained a day in their life. So it really makes a difference. And we both read studies that show, people who play, you know, soccer in their teenage years, especially women, are the ones that have much stronger bones when they're in
Yep.
their older life. No matter what they
Mhm.
weigh, they can still be petite females, but their bones have an inherent strength that the equivalent size structure person who did not play, athletics that involved a lot of pounding and running, you can see the difference. They're the ones that are going to have more of the osteoporotic issues or osteopenia. So, yeah, what we do in our teenage years up until we're 30 has everything to do with our bone health later in life.
And not to mention self-confidence, self-esteem, all the other things that go with early work in the body, in the physical body,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Yep.
So getting to bones, I have a femur. And for those of you who are not watching, I'm holding a femur bone up in front of me, right? And the femur is the classic bone. It's a long bone and it looks on the outside very smooth, right? There's nothing, and it's got some little bumps at the end and some bumps at the top. And one of the things that we want to start with is what you see on the outside of a bone is not what it looks like on the inside of the bone.
Mm,
Right.
yeah.
So if you look at it, any bone, like it's nice and smooth on the outside, there's a whole layer of solidity, right? What happens inside that, and this is because we want to be efficient as movers, we want the least amount of weight for the maximum amount of function because that decreases our energy usage as a human. So inside this nice solid looking bone is a whole bunch of basically spongy looking calcified arches and bridges and sponge like material, the
Yeah.
trabecular bone. Yeah.
Something that I think you told me a long time ago is that bones are strong as steel, but light as a feather. And they're
Exactly.
designed that way.
Hmm.
There's a portion of it that's hollow, that the
Hmm.
trabeculi, are built so that there is space in between, almost like a honeycomb when you look at it sideways.
Yes. Yep.
And there's a lot of space in there, but those arches create so much strength in the way that we load the bone. So it really
Right.
gives us a lot of support, but it doesn't weigh it down. I think I actually looked at the numbers, and if we did have the equivalent size in
Oh,
steel of our
right.
bones, it was
Right.
like 600 and some odd pounds we would weigh.
Exactly. And then our muscles
It's
would have to be four
ridiculous.
times as big, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
we'd be like Super Michelin
Exactly.
Man. Yeah. So just a reminder of that, right? We've got this nice smooth outside and this spongy, oddly shaped inside. And the thing about that inside is it's essentially like arches of calcified, what used to be cartilage, but it's basically calcified connective tissue. So that's sort of a funny idea. And one of the things that I like to think about that is those arches are formed based on the stresses that are put on that bone. So, in other words, you'll get thicker arches in the areas where the bone has pressure on it or it's being pulled on by muscle attachments. And you'll get, lighter bone in areas where it's not under so much stress. So again, I've got my femur up and there's some big bumps on the femur. Up at the top, there's something called the lesser trochanter, which the iliopsoas attaches onto, and it's a big bump. And it's a thick bump. And it's there because that muscle is pulling on it every time you flex your hips. Sit, walk, run, etc., kick something. All of those are going to stimulate the bone by pulling the muscle, pulls on the bone, that stimulates the bone to get thicker so that it can support the stress that's put on it. right? Rather than you look at the shaft of the bone isn't under so much stress. It's under kind of a, a
Compressive.
gravitational load, right? Compression, but it's not really being pulled or pushed in any particular direction. So it's just a nice, smooth, relatively smooth cylinder.
Yep. And if you think about not only the lesser trochanter, but right next to it, the greater trochanter, how many of those hip muscles, all this deep rotators of the hip, we're talking about the glutes are around that area, gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, all of those muscles are constantly being pulled on it. So it needs to be thick. It needs to be very, very strong because just every step we take, the gluteus medius is firing in order to hold us up. So as I take a step with my
Exactly.
right hand, with my right foot, that right hip, it pulls in, that muscle pulls on the bone. So every single step I take, that muscle is tugging and tugging and tugging at that bone all day long.
Today, I have to do a little pitch for bones. This is why I love bones. So one of the things that I learned in all the anatomy studies that I've done is if I can really understand how a joint works and how the bones move, that if I can maximize the efficiency of those movements of the joint, that will allow my muscles to be the most effective and efficient they can be. So a lot of times when I'm training somebody, the first thing in my mind is the joint moving appropriately? And if it
Sure.
is, then I know that the muscles will start to, maybe over time, start to adapt to that movement of the joint and become more efficient and effective. If the joint isn't moving well, then the muscles can't move well. So it's always one of those places where I start, especially in the upper body, with thinking about how the body moves. So that's why I love joints, because they're so important to movement.
Well, they are movement. For the human body, the joints
Exactly.
are movement. Uh, a lot of people just want to think about muscle. Muscles are
Right.
muscles are there to move the bones. They're there
Period.
for motion. That's it. They are
Yep.
literally, and our bones are literally just levers to allow for that movement. So we're talking about simple machines here.
Yeah.
In physics terms, we're talking about a very simple machine. We're talking about levers.
Hmm.
And when we're thinking about that, the muscles are just pulling on bones all day long. That's really what they do. And the joints are what really allow for that movement to occur.
And they allow the refinement of movement that we have as humans. So the
Yep.
example I sometimes use is you think of something like a jellyfish or a slug.
Mm,
Those don't have a skeleton
yep.
particularly, right? And so they can only move in a very general way. They can't pick up a pen and write a letter because there's
Mhm.
not that specificity. And really the bones provide that ability to articulate all those pieces.
Yep.
So there's my love letter to the bones. So should we talk about joints for a minute?
Let's talk about joints.
Okay. I'm going to start with the top of the femur. I'm going to start with a ball and socket joint because this is often how we think of joints. Most of them are not like this, but this is often how we think of it. If I look at the top of the femur, it's literally a ball. It's like the size of a golf ball, more or less. I mean, depending on
Mhm.
who you are. And if I look at the hip bone, the acetabulum, which means vinegar cup, by the way, from Latin, it's like a cup. And so the cup of the acetabulum holds the ball of the femur. And they create the ability, because it's a round ball inside a round cup, of being able to move in a lot of different directions: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation. With some stability, because that cup really surrounds the head of the femur, right? Surrounds the ball and creates a stability there, which allows us to stand and move and do all the things we do with a relatively stable hip joint.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there is that's your basic ball and socket joint. And that's how we like to think of joints. But many of them, like, this is the most stable joint in the body in a lot of ways.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you
And
think of other ball and socket joints, they are nowhere near as complete as the hip joint. The hip, actually, that ball sits into the socket. You know, that ball and socket,
yep,
it sits inside,
it's swallowed by the socket, basically.
whereas no
And
other one really is.
no, you look at the ball and socket for the shoulder,
Yeah.
and you basically got a big humeral head, so the head of the humerus, and I don't have good bones, sorry, I'm using my fingers, but it's maybe, it's smaller than the head of the femur, but it's fairly large. It's like
Mhm.
maybe a small tennis ball or one of those little bouncy
Golf ball
balls you
things.
get in the
Yeah.
machines. Yeah, golf ball things. And basically all the socket is essentially something about the size of a quarter that has a slight indentation in it.
Yep.
Right? So the head, the ball is way bigger than the socket,
Yep.
creating, again, a huge amount of mobility in the shoulder, but
Yes.
not a lot of stability in the shoulder. A lot of potential, not a lot of inherent stability without the ligaments and the other elements of the joint.
Yeah. And that's the other thing to think about is that what gives us that stability are those ligaments. So in the hip joint,
Right, right, right.
if the muscles do hold it in, but it's really the ligaments that surround the hip joint that actually provide the structure that says, okay, this is the limiting factor. This is as far as you're allowed to move. It's a range of motion limiter. It's going to say this is as much as you're allowed to go. But if you think about dancers, that's still a huge amount of range of motion for the hip. Huge amount.
Mhm.
We have the potentiality for a lot of us when we're young is very, very great. Now, for a 60-year-old, male who hasn't moved much, maybe not as much. Maybe his potentiality is a little bit less. But for young people, you watch kids move. Oh my gosh, their range of motion is incredible.
Yeah,
And
for the
because
most
part of
part,
it is they're still
they're
developing.
right, right. So a couple things we wanted to say about that. One is when you think about how the ligaments support the joint, two things. One, as Brian said, the ligaments are range limiters or range allowers, depending on whether your glass is half full or half empty. And essentially, the ligaments don't really come into play until you come to the end range, and then they reach their limit and they stop you from going too far.
Mhm.
Primarily, right? If you're in a neutral position, those ligaments are not particularly taut. They're just hanging out, waiting for stress to come into them. One of the things I say about that is the range of motion of your ligaments comes from a bunch of things. And this is where, like, people always ask me, well, why don't I have the range of motion that Sally has? Or why am I
Mhm.
so stiff? Or why am I so loose? They don't usually ask that. They just ask, why am I so stiff? A lot of that is your ligament structure. And the ligament structure is dependent on a few things. It's dependent on your genetics, so how you
Mhm.
developed, right? There's certain people, like I think of my husband, who I consider kind of a Polish dock worker, who is super stiff in all of his joints, and that's just like that's how he was born, that's how he's lived, and thank God, because his joints are as solid as a rock. He's never had any issues there. I, on the other hand, am a loose goose dancer person who has all kinds of looseness in my ligaments, where I can dislocate things without too much trouble. So when we think about how we develop range of motion, there's the genetics, which is part of it. The second piece is how you use that joint as a
Yeah.
young person. And the two classic examples of that are pitchers. So I'm thinking,
Mhm.
pitchers and tennis players, and dancers. So pitchers and tennis players do a lot of shoulder range of motion, especially in external
Yep.
rotation, for either pitching or for returning a serve, right? And because they do so much of that when they're younger and their ligaments are forming, they create more range of motion in
Yep.
those ranges than somebody who doesn't test those will. Same thing with swimmers, have some of that too, because they're using a lot of range of motion in there.
Yeah, I think also muscularly, when you train it at a very
Mhm.
young age and you train flexibility, the muscles are much more adaptable as well. So they're
Yeah.
more pliable. They're going to grow. And I'm I'll bring myself into this. When I was young, my mom was an aerobic instructor in Hawaii and she wanted to get more flexible. Well, I was the only person that she had available to her in the evening on a regular basis.
To
So she would
assist.
have me sit down, feet to feet, straddle position, wide straddle, and I'd pull on her, then she'd pull on me. Well, I got to tell
Mhm.
you, as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, I was out of shape. I was very overweight. I could kick my leg well over my head. My hamstring flexibility and adductor flexibility
Mhm.
stayed with me for a long time. And it's still a lot more than most people my age and especially male. And it's because I trained it with her for a long period of time, you know, and your muscles do over time begin to develop like that. So you have both the ligaments as well as the muscles. And like you said about the bones, what you do to it, your body will adapt,
Mhm.
you know?
One of the things, yeah. I mean, one of the funny examples here, if any of you are fans of shows like Bones, which has been off the air for a while, but it's basically about a forensic anthropologist, right? Who would look at bones and could tell from the bones what that person did. They were a right-handed carpenter, or they were a violin, like how do they figure that out? So the bones respond in honestly fairly obvious and not
Mhm.
always subtle ways to whatever stresses are put on them.
Yes.
And one thing I like to say with that, and this is important if you're working with children or younger people, teenagers up through kind of early 20s, is bones are not fully solidified and fully calcified until we're done growing, essentially, which
Yeah.
makes sense, right? Calcium doesn't grow, collagen can grow, and connective tissue can grow, cartilage can grow. And then what happens is as we get older, that starts to calcify. And it's in that process of calcification that we create the shape, for example, of the acetabulum, the shape of the humeral head or the femoral head, and the shape of the final shape of our bones happens as that cartilage, which we start out with, calcifies.
Hmm. And something that I want to bring up here that I don't think people realize is that, let's take you and I, for instance. Okay.
Mhm.
We stand next to each other. We look very, very different from one another, not only male, female, but our backgrounds, everything. I've got a very large rib cage. I got very large hip bones. My shoulders are very wide. You know, you're pretty much the exact opposite, a lot more
Yeah.
compact in those regards.
Yeah.
And because of that, our bones are going to be different sizes, are going to be different shapes. And I think
Mhm.
it's a misnomer when almost every single skeleton is like a 5'4" male, that's hanging in the closet in an anatomy lab somewhere, and they pull it out and they all look the same. They're all the same size. All the vertebrae are the same size. And you look at that and people assume, well, that's what my skeleton must look like. But you and I have
Mhm.
done this before where we've put the scapula on my scapula and mine's like twice the size. My hips are
Yes.
this much wider than its, and they're both males. Like, you know, I think that different sizes, people are going to be taller, shorter, whatever. Your bones are going to adapt to that and adapt to the weight that you're actually carrying on top of that.
Exactly, and grow to the size you're going to grow to. I mean, if you're six foot
Bingo.
four, you need different bones than if you're 5'0". Like you just
Exactly.
do, just to support
Yep.
the height and the gravity and the musculature and the weight and all that other stuff. So a classic example of that, I've got just a picture of a lumbar vertebra up, or a little model of a lumbar vertebra up on the screen. And when I was doing some dissection a long time ago, I've told Brian this story, but I had a big guy. He was probably 6'4", probably weighed 350 or so, and not so much weight as just a big guy. I mean, his shoulders were like 3 feet wide. And when we got down to his lumbar vertebra, his fifth lumbar vertebra was like the size of a tea saucer. I mean, it was huge. It was like, 5 or 6 inches across the body of that vertebra. And
Yep.
that was in order to support that whole structure.
Yep.
And that was just, that was a real eye opener for me. Because again, the models that you see, whether it's 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional or a skeleton in the closet or whatever it is, those create a vision for how things are that may or may not be at all accurate.
Yeah.
Right. And I love
Absolutely.
putting a scapula up on your back and going like, oh, look, this is just scapula. And Brian's goes higher, lower, and wider in all directions because
Yeah.
he's not a small person.
Right. And that's something just to keep in mind. What we see in those anatomy books, and
Mhm.
when we
Yeah.
have a skeleton in the room, you're looking at it and thinking, oh, that's what everybody. No, that is one person that was made from a
Yes.
model, a
Yep.
form way back when. It could be in the 50s for all we know that original model
Exactly.
was made
Exactly.
when people were a lot smaller. And I think you were the one who told me that a lot of them came out of India. And so we're talking about someone who is probably older, Indian. Their bodies are going to be a lot different than a Caucasoid, someone who may be from Norway or
Right.
Asian from China, or, all over the place. We have different structures to ourselves, and we have to remember that.
Exactly. Exactly. So thinking about bones, we talked a little bit about just joint, a little bit of ligament, and we talked about a very classic joint, right? That hip joint and the ball and socket joint. But thinking about other ways that the bones go together,
Hmm.
right? There's very stable joints and there's very not so stable joints necessarily.
Yeah.
Um, and there's joints that move in different ways. So I've also got, and I'll put this on the screen too, I've got a knee joint. So we've talked about the hip joint, not talking about the knee joint. So we've got our femur, which has these two things called condyles, which look like two wheels at the bottom of the femur joint. Yeah, or the bottom of the femur bone, I should say. Right. So there's a medial and a lateral condyle, which are just like little wheels. And this is why we can flex and extend the knee, because those condyles kind of roll and create that glide, if you will, or that flexion. Then we have the top of the tibia. And I put some cartilage on here. So I know it's white, but we've got a little cartilage on here if you can't see it. The top of the tibia looks like it's kind of flat with two little indentations in it. So there's not a lot of integrity, natural integrity in that joint. If
No.
I put that joint together, if there weren't ligaments and muscles, these would, as soon as I went into flexion, that femur would just fall off, and that would be that,
Well,
right?
think of a marble on a tabletop, a round surface and a
Exactly.
flat surface. They don't
Right,
mate together very
rolls?
well.
No. And so we've got the round bottom of the femur and the relatively, again, there's little cups in our tibia, but that's
Shallow,
really, they're
very
just
shallow.
shallow little cups that those big wheels at the bottom of the femur kind of slide in. So there's, again, we talked about the ligaments of the hip a bit. There's also so two things here. We're going to talk a little bit about the cartilage, the meniscus, if you will. I'm sure you've all heard about the menisci or knee cartilage or that kind of thing. And this happens in the hip too with the labrum, but in the knee, it's more like we call it the menisci, which are these two little, they're like little half moons of connective tissue that basically deepen the cup. So they take that shallow little bony cup and they make it just a little bit deeper to create more continuity or congruency or integrity, really, with how the femur meets the tibia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and the menisci, if any of you have had a meniscus tear, which, many people have, it's a very, very common knee injury, right? You can see how if those are basically trying to keep that knee integral while you are bending and straightening it, which we do like 900 million times a day, you just think about the old, 10,000 steps. Even if you're doing 5,000 steps a day, every time you step, you're flexing and extending that knee. And you think about that over a lifetime, you've got 365 days and then you've got 85 years. That is an amazing amount of flexion and extension. And one of the things that I love to think about with that is that all of these tissues are living tissues.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's really easy to think about the bones as being like, I always pictured George O'Keeffe's skeleton on the desert floor, that it's dead. It's just this dead thing that lives inside you. But no, the bones are constantly being reshaped, reformed. Every time you move them, they get some stimulation. They're also building and breaking down depending on our calcium needs in the rest of the body.
Yep.
So again, the little menisci, which look like these little tiny little bits of tissue, have an incredible amount of resiliency, and they do have some ability to maintain their health. They don't really repair very easily. So I'm trying not to give you too much hope up front, right? But they do have some ability. Their blood supply to them, they have some ability to regenerate and to stay healthy for a long, long, long time, for many decades for most people. Yeah. So that's kind of an amazing thing about the body, is it is a living tissue. So the bones can change shape and respond. The tissues, the ligaments, the cartilages and things that support the joints can all really hold things together for a really long time. For the most part, obviously things break down at different times, but they don't always break down. And it's amazing that they can keep going as long as they can.
And something about the meniscus and all the ligament structures of the knee joint is essentially a hinge, if you think about it, because it only does flexion and extension. So again, the meniscus as well as the other ligament structures create that range of motion. They're really dictating that it's going to do flexion, extension, a little bit of rotation, especially when the knee is bent. We have a little bit of rotation. But if you think about that, we're really truly looking at a hinge joint.
Yep.
You
It
know,
just goes
it's
this
going,
way and it goes this way.
yep, flexion and extension primarily.
But one thing to think about there, and I love this image of the knee, is for the longest time, I really did think about it as a hinge joint. But if I think about a door hinge, that would mean that my femur just hinged off of it and would fall off the
Mhm.
back. So instead, what I like to think of is when I'm bending my knee, it's like that femur is rolling. So as the top of the femur is going backwards, the front of the femur is actually rolling forward on that tibia, so that
Mhm.
I maintain what's called joint congruency, meaning that the center of the ball of that those condyles, or the bottom of the femur, stays centered over the tibia. If that makes some sense, maybe it does. So basically, it's going to roll, glide, and slide. And that's where the femur has this wonderful ability to stay integrated with the tibia.
Mhm. Mhm. And the interesting thing I found about the meniscus is that the way that they're connected, they only have two connection points. They actually float. They actually move forward and back. So as we bend our knee,
Yeah,
the condyle actually does rotate over, but it also rotates slightly backwards, slightly on the joint. So those meniscus actually track back and forward a little bit as we flex and extend. So they're moving with us.
right.
They're
Yep,
basically holding those condyles in place like
yep.
an ice cream cone, holding
Yes, like a cup.
the ice cream, and it's sort of moving with it. I was like, I got you. I'm going to move. And it allows for that rotation. I love the thought that you just said, that unlike a true hinge, this
Mhm.
is actually more of a rotation around an axis. And the
Yes,
axis would be looking at
yes.
its the side,
Yep,
where as we're rolling, it's rolling within the joint, and the joint is actually moving those ligament structures, whether we're talking about the meniscus or the ligament structures themselves. And we've talked about this in our knee episode. They're actually tracking forward, back, side to side to allow for that and to keep the knee in place. So again, we consider it a modified hinge joint, but it allows that flexion and extension. So there's a lot going on in the knee that most people don't ever think about, that we take for granted.
and to get back to ligaments, because I know we talked about this in the knee, but just to put joints together, and I think the knee is a nice way to do this. When you think about the ligaments of the knee, it's kind of straightforward, because really what you want to have is you want to have the femur not going forward or back on the tibia,
Yeah.
or side to side on the tibia, as a very in a simplistic view. So there's a ligament that goes on the medial side connecting the femur and the tibia, on the lateral side connecting the femur and the tibia. So that keeps it from basically falling off sideways should you
Yep.
get hit, in the side of the knee, or again have your foot stabilized while you are rotating another direction. And then there's what's called the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments, which keep the femur and the tibia from sliding forward and back on each other.
Yep.
So it's such an elegant structure. It's kind of like, I love that about the knee, that basically there's just these very simple little ligaments that keep that integrity of that joint. Yeah, and just inside, outside, front and back, and that femur then is organized in a way that keeps it gliding and sliding. Again, for most of us, for like 80 years or 90 years,
Yep.
with integrity. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing.
So that's the second type of joint that we're talked about,
Yep,
hinge joints. We have the ball and socket, we have the hinge.
yep. Now, I'm going to use a foot. A foot there's a lot of joints in a foot.
Oh my
So just to
gosh.
say, there's quite a few varieties of joints in a foot. So a couple things. One is, first, looking at the tibio. I think I call it the tibio-talar joint, but some people just call it the curl. What do they call that? Somebody
I've
else
always called it
knows.
yeah.
Anyway, okay. Anyway, there's a lot of confusing names about this. I'm going to be kind of straightforward here. So there's where the tibia meets the talus. And the nice thing about the foot, and what we'll go through, is if you think about the joints of the foot, each of them provide a different kind of mobility for the foot, because the foot is our interface with the ground. And
Mhm.
until really quite recently, the ground was not as predictable as it is now.
Yep.
right? Again, I've spent a little bit of time in Europe, and walking on cobblestones with high heels is just, oh, so much fun. Um, you're like, okay, I mean, I literally, I had one pair of fairly spiky high heels, and on cobblestones, I just walk in the ball of my feet because I have
Yeah.
no idea where that heel is going to land in a hole and just send me in some other direction. So anyway, thinking about this, how joints create the potential of movement. If I look at the bottom of the tibia, and I've got a really nice model of the foot that I love because it's all elastic. Look at the bottom of the tibia. It has this really nice arch in it. So it's got basically an arch. So it's got a curve in it. And then that matches what I think of as the top of the talus, which is like a dome. So we talked about the ball and socket being around and around. This is more like a dome and then an arch that goes over the dome. So that allows primarily flexion and extension of the ankle, or plantar flexion and dorsiflexion of the ankle. And so that's a very important movement. Like without that, we can't walk. If you've ever worked with a client who's had a serious ankle fusion because of usually ankle breaks or other kind of things, you lose that flexion and extension, everything is kind of whacked from there on up, because that's a really critical piece of human locomotion, is that
Yep.
plantar flexion, dorsiflexion.
And that's
So
still considered a hinge joint primarily.
it is, and this literally is a hinge,
Yep.
more
It just
so than
hinges.
really in some ways than the knee. It just goes forward and it goes back.
Yep.
And that, again, those just move together, creating that nice, beautiful action of dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. Then I'm going to go forward from there through my talus to my navicular. So again, I got the talus here, the side bone, I got the navicular. And we'll talk more about the talus in a minute. Now, if I open that up, you can't see it terribly well, but basically the front of the talus is also kind of like a knuckle. So it's a little bit round. And if I look at the top of the navicular, it's got a hollow in it. And these hollows are more round. This is almost like a mini ball and socket joint.
I think it is considered a ball and socket joint
Yeah.
classification wise.
Yeah. So and what that allows, I've got flexion and extension with my tibia and my talus, and then my talus and my navicular, I've got this rotation ability, right? So you think about landing on a root or landing on a rock or being on any kind of a wiggly surface, and you want some of that mobility between the hind foot, which is relatively stable, and the forefoot, which has to accommodate to whatever wiggliness, is happening in terms of the ground. So there's our talus and our navicular. Then we've got the other side of the talus. So now I'm looking at the lateral side of the foot, and I'm going to open that up. And the talus now is like, it's such a weird bone because it has the joint to the tibia up above it, the joint to the navicular in front of it, and then it's got a complex series of joints on the bottom that interact with the calcaneus, with the heel bone. And it's called the subtalar joint, or that's usually what I hear it called. And that actually is a rather stable joint. There's a little bit of a glide in there, but I think it's more of a gliding joint than anything else. And there's not a lot of mobility. So again, if you're on YouTube, you can see that I'm trying to wiggle that joint, and it doesn't go very far. So it creates a little bit of more stability, again, at the back of the heel, at that hind foot. Then moving forward, we have straight old gliding joints. So here we've got our cuneiforms and our cuboid, which are basically kind of little squares, or little more or less squares that basically just glide around on each other and slide around on each other. And they don't have a lot of articulation that way. They just are able to open up. So they're able to round, they're able to glide a little bit if there's a rotational component happening. But basically, there's just a little bit of movement side to side, up and down, and in a few directions, but they're not major joints, right? Again, they're designed to be relatively stable, but have that ability to accommodate to an unstable surface.
So a gliding joint is basically where two flat surfaces meet up against one another and sort of just allow movement side to side, forward and back, up and down, that sort of thing.
Exactly, depending on what's around them. Yeah.
Right.
And then going forward, we have also pretty much gliding joints between the cuneiforms and the cuboid and the metatarsals. Those are also pretty flat joint to flat joint. And those are going to, again, provide more or less just that ability to glide. Yeah, glide and slide.
So you can see all
Then,
of these bones that are there are really allowing for superior articulation, much like our hands. They're
yes.
they're they're meant for us to walk on unstable surfaces, to be
Mhm.
able to allow that and even climb trees, do things that, evolutionarily we may have, you know, opted out of, but we still have the potential to be able to do all of that. So our
And
feet
many
really,
and many still do.
and many still do. I sure did as a child, let me tell you. So yeah, if you think about the amount of articulation that a foot really has, it's unbelievable. And it's because it has all of these different bones that are
Right.
articulating with one another.
Right. Without the joints, the foot wouldn't have the capabilities it has.
No.
Right. And if you think about, the rare cases where somebody loses the ability to use their hands and they end up training their foot to do a lot of what the hand can do, right? That's the potential. And what is there,
Mhm.
26 or something bones in the foot, something like that?
Something like that. Yeah.
Anyway, I may have my numbers wrong, but it's close. Right. And that number of joints means you have that amount of articulation.
Yep.
Right? It's very different than like femur, tibia, fibula, right? 3 bones create kind of a simple movement. Here you've got all these bones that allow a lot of subtlety and a lot of different kinds of articulations to accommodate to complex movement.
Yep. Yep. And we covered a lot of this when we talked about our foot a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
That really, when you think about being in a shoe, your shoe does sort of fix everything a little bit flat,
Yeah.
gives it great, now let's be
Great
honest, it gives it
stability.
great stability. It's gonna
Yep.
stabilize it. However, it's going to fixate it to a certain degree, whereas when you're barefoot, there's a lot more articulation. You can really use those muscles a lot more, and the intrinsic muscles of the foot become a lot more active and dynamic.
And I've just been, one of the advancement principles course I've been teaching lately is the lower body. And it's been interesting working with a lot of different Pilates teachers where I teach them the kind of the foot stuff and it's new to them. Like
Yeah.
most people haven't thought about the foot, even if you're kind of in this world. And you said, personal trainers generally are in shoes and the foot is
Yep.
almost
Nothing.
entirely ignored, right?
Yep.
So anyway, that's just a little plug for the foot, which is either in front of us or behind us. One other little joint we'll talk about, and we may go through some more, but these are the key ones, or another one I'll talk about. If you think about the vertebra, I've got 2 lumbar vertebrae here with me with a very flattened disc because my disc squashed. This is called an irregular bone because it's totally weird, right? There's like all kinds of different bits and pieces to this bone that aren't like any other bone.
Yeah. How could you name every single one when you look at something like the scapula, the sternum, the vertebrae? They're funny looking, they're funny shaped. You can't name them all or else there'd be
No.
27 different types of bone, different classifications of bones.
Yep. So they just all lump these into irregular. It's an irregular bone. That's all we need to know. We're good.
Yep.
So a couple things about this, and again, we're talking a lot about bones and joints and how those produce or don't produce movement, right? And how that works together. So if I'm looking at the bone, now this also shows one other key thing that bones do, which is protect us.
Mhm.
Right. So in this case, the bone is protecting the spinal cord, a critical piece of communication hardware for the body, or software and hardware really for the body.
Yep.
You think about the skull, it protects
For
the
the brain.
brain, also another critical piece of hardware. You think about the rib cage,
Yep.
protecting the heart and the lungs, because
Yep.
those are the organs that without which we die, period.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
If they get damaged, we're done. You think about the abdomen, like, yeah, well, you can jab a spleen, you can poke a liver, you can irritate the bowel, and the body isn't so concerned. It hasn't created a bony protection for that area, but it
Yep.
has for the brains, the spinal cord, the heart, the lungs.
Yep.
So here, this is a lumbar vertebra that I'm showing, and what I like to show on this one is what are called the facet joints. So there's the big body of the vertebra where the disc lives, and that's a fun part, just a nice, simple kind of round disc. But then looking at the back of the bone, I've got two little wings, and sometimes they look like ears to me, or they look like, I don't know, little things that stick up on the top of the vertebra and stick up on the bottom of the vertebra. And these are the facet joints. And the facet joints are really where movement happens in the spine. And the shape of the facet joints directly relates to the movement potential of that area. So I've got a lumbar vertebra up, and if I look at the facet joints here, this is going to sound really funny. So I think about the lumbar vertebra as looking like a moose head. Now, this never works in Europe because they don't have many moose in Europe. They have a lot of moose in America. It's not a common animal. And Asia, they look at me like I've lost my mind. So I have to put up a picture of a moose. But if you have a picture of a moose in your mind, it's got a big nose, and then it's got like these really funny ears, and it's got those big gigantic antlers. So I think of it as the two facet joints on the lumbar vertebra, in our little moose analogy. It's like the ears are looking towards the nose. You know, if you've ever watched a dog and they've got like a fly, I picture a horse or something, where a fly lands on their nose and their ear goes, what's happening to my nose? Right? That's what I think about those little ears as being. Yeah, so they're pointing in on the top, and then on the bottom, like the little whiskers are pointing out. So that allows, because they're pointing in, that means like I don't have a lot of rotation ability. I'm taking the two vertebrae and I'm trying to rotate them, and they just bang into each other because those facet joints don't have any mobility. Yeah, just boink. They can flex, they can extend, they can side bend, but they can't rotate. And that changes as we go up the spine. You've got like the ears are much flatter when I go up into the thoracic and the cervical. So we've got flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and rotation up in the rest of the vertebra.
If you think of any of the facet joints, just like any joint in the body, it's going to dictate your range of motion. So in the lumbar spine, we get flexion, extension, lateral flexion, not much rotation. The thoracic, you add a little bit more rotation, not as much extension, and it's all dictated by the joint itself. The joint tells you, I want you to turn like this. I want you to lift like this. So like you said, the shoulder, high amount of mobility because we can reach overhead and whatnot. And that joint is what allows that to happen. It opens everything up. So yeah, the bones themselves are created that way to allow movement in certain directions and also to restrict movement in other directions.
Exactly. So one other thing about that is, like, again, we talked a little bit about just how ligaments get created, but I have a lot of people who say, well, what about contortionists? What about like the Cirque du Soleil contortionists, or people who have like hypermobility spectrum disorders of various different kinds. And there, again, it may be joint structure that allows more mobility, and it's also ligament structure that allows more mobility. So a lot of times in those cases, it's a connective tissue difference that allows those ligaments to have a lot more elastin, a lot less collagen, a lot more mobility than, let's say, somebody who's much stiffer would have.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. So let's see what other bones I have around here. I've got one other option, which is basically two things. I've got a pivot. So basically a pivoting bone. And the one I'm showing on the screen is where the radius meets the ulna in the elbow. So the top of the radius is round, right? And it's held together by what's called an annular ligament. So a ligament that goes around it and stabilizes it against the ulna. And basically that can rotate, and that's what allows us to go from pronation to supination of the forearm. Yeah, so that's what that rolling, the radius rotates, or the radius rolls, and that's what allows that mobility to happen. Now, again, the top of the ulna is another hinge joint, but a very different hinge joint than the knee. Yeah. So I always laugh here. Hang on a second. I've got to go find my.
There you go.
I just had to find my humerus. It
Yeah.
was sitting in a bag behind me. So if I look at the bottom of the humerus, I've got, again, this is my femur bone, right? It's got like a divot in it, a groove here, and then it's got like a little, it's called a trochlea, which is kind of like a, what'd you call those, Brian? Like on those little pulley, like a pulley
Yes.
system, right? That you go around the trochlea there. So this little, I always think of this as being like, a little mouth. The top of the ulna always looks like a mouth to me because it's kind of like a little C shape. And that goes right into that little divot. And that is another hinge joint, but a
Yep.
very different. This is much more like a real hinge, right? If you think about a
Yeah.
door hinge, it's not like the knee, and it's not really even like the tibia and the talus. This is a whole different, this is really a hinge.
hmm Well,
Yeah,
unlike the knee, if you think about it, the amount of rotation that you need in the elbow joint comes from the pivot joint and not
right.
from the actual elbow joint.
Exactly. That elbow joint, so where the, again, the humerus meets the ulna, that is just a hinge joint. That just
Yep.
goes into flexion and extension. That's all it does. And all of the rotation happens in the rotation, the rolling of that radius and that a radius over the ulna.
Yep.
Right? That's really where we get the mobility and the rotation of the forearm. And there's
Yep.
a whole lot more there than there is in the lower leg, which is a good thing, I think. Yeah. So that's the difference between, again, we've got another little like a pivot joint, and then we've also got, again, a different version of a hinge joint.
hmm
So it's just so like, there's just so many wonderful options and variations on how things work here in the body.
I was talking with I had a client come in yesterday for an assessment, and we were talking about the body and how he said he was amazed that he's lived this long and that his body has functioned as long as it has.
Absolutely.
And I said, we are, if you think about it, one of the most perfect machines. But if one major thing happens, there's a cascading effect that we don't function nearly as well as we did before. And the
Right.
bones are kind of like that. Our bones are sort of the gears and sprockets that are inside of a machine. They allow us to move. The muscles are turning all of those bones and allow for great mobility, allow us to ambulate, to walk, to stand, to sit, to twist, to run, to do all the things that we need to do in order to live. And those bones are a living tissue inside the body that are constantly supporting that. You know, we talked about how they provide protection. Well, they also provide nutrients. They're a storage
Right.
unit. You know, they're a
Yep.
bank. They're a storage unit for calcium that if we don't get enough
Yep.
nutritionally, your body will say, ah, don't worry about it. I got a little saved up. We'll give you some. So it can do that. It's part of your immune system. You know, it
Right.
helps us for healing with our bone
Right.
marrow. So those bones do so much for us that I think they're kind of an unsung hero in the body that most people take for granted.
Yeah, they take for granted because they don't think of them as living tissue,
Yeah.
right? And to bring us slightly back to that osteoporosis piece, our bones are our calcium store,
Yep.
right? And there's osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So osteo means bone, clast means breakdown, blast means buildup, basically. And those are two different kinds of cells that either build up the calcium in the bones and strengthen the bones or break them down. And a lot of how that happens does depend on what our need for calcium is in the body and the available calcium that is floating around, waiting to be either put into bone or, if necessary, taken out of bone. So
Yep.
this is where the nutrition of calcium, in terms of maintaining enough calcium throughout your life, can help to keep the bones built up. But you also have to create the demand from the bones for the calcium, and that happens through weight bearing, through exercise, all those kind of things.
Yep. Yep. So a lot that we talked about today in just our skeletal system that I think,
Mhm.
again, important for us to realize and to remember and not just take that for granted when we think about the human body. And especially when we're thinking about movement, working with our clients or even working with our own bodies, not to take
Yeah.
that for granted, how important that is. And I love how you said when you're looking at the body, and I've done the same thing. This is how I will try and focus my trainings is what movement do I want to accomplish?
Mhm.
Are the joints working properly to accomplish that movement? If not, what do I need to do to make that happen better? And if it is, okay, now how can I load this? So those joints have a specific range of motion. Is it working properly? And when you said that's how you look at it, that's the perfect way to think about how to train the body. Is the joint working properly? If not, how do we get it to work properly? And let's figure out how to load it there.
So one thing about getting it to work properly, like, what does that mean? And
Mm,
so one of the examples I'm going to use is, and this is a term called joint congruency. We talked a little bit about that with the knee example we just used, right? Where the femur ideally is staying, the condyles of the femur are staying relatively centered over the tibia as it goes into flexion and extension.
mhm.
And that maintains the integrity of the joint. One example I use a lot, and there's a shoulder, but it's complex. I'm going to use the hip because it's a little simpler. One example I use a lot is, where is the femoral head in the acetabulum?
Yep.
And this seems like, well, isn't it just always in the right place? And it's like, no, sorry, but it's not always. And one of the things that, this is really simple, you guys can do this with me, is a lot of times what I'm playing with that is, how is that femoral head gliding in the acetabulum? And particularly in abduction.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
So if you're following along, don't do this if you're driving, but if you happen to be standing up or can stand up, take a moment and, just standing on both feet, shift your hips from side to side and put your hands kind of at or just above the greater trochanter. And what I want you to feel is, you should get a little crease right above, kind of above the greater trochanter. And that lets me know that that femoral head is is descending in the acetabulum as you go into abduction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was a lot that I just said, but that idea is that you want to make that happen. You want to allow that femoral head to glide in the socket. It's not just staying centered. Obviously, it has to roll in there, but is it rolling appropriately? And for example, in Pilates, there's side lying leg work, right? If you've ever done Pilates mat, you've done some version of side lying leg work. And what I find is, people can do side lying leg work either from abduction.
Mm-hmm.
And what I say is, you'll actually see that crease in their hip, or they can just lift the whole leg up by doing that crease from their waist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They can just lift the hip up, and that the whole leg will lift because the hip's going, but you're not actually getting that articulation of the femur and the acetabulum.
Yep.
Yeah, and many clients with hip issues, I've worked on just exactly that, getting abduction to work, and it has changed a lot of things and really cleared up a lot of hip issues. One other thing that I think about in terms of joint mechanics is a posterior tilt of the pelvis and shoving that femoral head slightly forward in the socket. And when that happens, what I find there is, turn this guy around because I'm looking at the back of him, right? What happens there is that's when clients get anterior hip trouble, labrum tears, bursitis, anterior hip bursitis, irritation of the iliopsoas tendon as it goes over the top of the femoral head, and other kinds of issues. And that'll times, if you really posterior tilt and kind of push your pelvis forward, I feel like that femur, and again, this is a little bit of an image, but slides forward in that acetabulum.
Yes.
And puts pressure on those anterior structures. So if you correct that pelvic posture so they're a little more neutral, that brings that femoral head back slightly and takes some stress off of those structures. If there's a labral tear or a bursitis, all I work on is like posture, like posture,
Yep.
posture.
Yep. So working on joint congruency can be incredibly important to any client that has some dysfunction, has muscular imbalance, has something that we would consider for corrective exercise that you need to correct.
Mhm.
That's one of the things to look at immediately. That's one of the first things to look at is the joint working properly? Are the bones lined up properly? Now, sometimes there are misalignments that go beyond what we can do just
Way beyond,
because
yeah.
they're not, I've had a number of clients who had egg-shaped femoral heads. They weren't round,
Right.
they were shaped like eggs, so they ground down the acetabulum, and in their
Mhm.
mid-40s, they were suddenly bone on bone, couldn't figure out why. Well, it's just the way that they were made. Now, again, that's a very
Mhm.
small percentage of people, but for the most part, you can really create better joint congruency through movement and getting them to know where their body is in space and really understand where that is, put them in different positions, change their posture and their of their pelvis or the bones, and get their body to respond better. So joint congruency is very important.
Yep. And a really nice place to, like, anytime I've got a client with any kind of pathology, that's where I start.
Yeah.
So are we wrapping up, Brian? Is it wrap
Yep.
up time?
It's wrap up
Okay.
time. We talked about the bones a lot today. We
We
did a super deep dive on the bones and the joints. We went into the different types of joints in the body, synovial joints primarily. So yeah, I think we covered quite a bit. So do us a favor. If you guys have a topic you'd like to cover, hit us up with an email. We'd really appreciate it. Movingcombos@gmail.com. Hit that like and subscribe button on the platform of your choice. Comment when you see us on Facebook, when you see us on Instagram, hit us a comment, even if it's just a thumbs up or a heart or something like that. Every time we get those, it pushes us up in some algorithm somewhere, something beyond what I understand. So, but I'm told it helps. So I'm just saying, please do us a favor, do that. And yeah, so for Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. Until next week, we'll see you then.
Bye, guys.